The first bullet tore through the saloon window, followed by cold winter air that stung harsher than the whiskey Jackson Irwin had been nursing for the better part of the evening. 1877 had been a cruel year to him, and December showed no signs of mercy. The town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, had long since stopped whispering about Jackson when he entered a room. They no longer needed to. The hollow man who'd once been the most respected rancher in the territory had become a ghost in his own skin, haunting the same stool at Murphy's saloon night after night. "Might want to ease up there, Jack," Murphy said, sliding a glass of water beside the whiskey. "That's your fourth tonight." Jackson stared at the water with disinterest, his weather-beaten face expressionless beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. At 32, the lines around his eyes belonged to a much older man. "Just pour, Murphy. Don't pretend you care." "Suit yourself," Murphy shrugged, moving away to attend to other patrons. 2 years since the raid that took everything from him: his wife, his child, his purpose. 2 years since he'd put down roots in this dusty corner of nowhere, purchasing a small ranch he barely maintained, keeping just enough cattle to justify his existence. 2 years since he'd felt anything but the burning of whiskey down his throat. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them another frigid gust and the sound of approaching stagecoach wheels. Jackson didn't turn. New arrivals meant nothing to him. Another miner seeking fortune, another gunslinger chasing reputation, another family foolish enough to believe the West held promise. None of it mattered. "Heard there's a storm coming," the barkeep continued, undeterred by Jackson's silence. "Bad one from what the telegraph says. You might want to head back to your place before it hits." Jackson emptied his glass in a single swallow. "Storm's already hit where I live," he muttered, dropping coins on the counter and rising to his full height. At 6 feet 2 inches, he cut an imposing figure despite the slight slouch of his shoulders. He stepped out into the street just as the stagecoach pulled to a stop before the town's only hotel. Jackson pulled his coat tighter, preparing for the solitary ride back to his ranch. The driver was helping passengers down when a commotion erupted. A horse had broken free from the livery down the street, spooked by something, and was charging toward the stagecoach. Women screamed. Men shouted. The passengers scattered, all except one who had just stepped down, her back to the danger, unaware of the approaching threat. Jackson moved without thought, years of instinct breaking through the haze of alcohol and apathy. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms around the woman and rolling with her clear of the horse's path. They landed hard on the packed earth, Jackson taking most of the impact. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. When she looked up at him, the world stopped for a heartbeat. Her eyes were the color of summer sky, bright against skin flushed with cold and surprise. But it was her smile, hesitant, relieved, genuine, that struck him like a physical blow. "Thanks to you, I believe I am," she answered, her voice carrying a slight southern lilt. "Though I fear my hat may never recover." Indeed, the fashionable bonnet lay crushed beneath the wheel of the stagecoach. For the first time in 2 years, Jackson felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "I reckon hats are easier to replace than people," he said, helping her to her feet. "Beatrice Morgan," she offered, extending a gloved hand once she'd brushed the dust from her traveling dress. "I'd say it's a pleasure to meet you, but I generally prefer introductions that don't involve being tackled to the ground." "Jackson Irwin," he replied, taking her hand briefly. "And I generally avoid introductions altogether." She laughed, a sound as unexpected as spring rain in the desert, and Jackson felt something in his chest stir, something he'd long considered dead and buried. "Mr. Irwin saves the day again," called the telegraph operator from the boardwalk. Just like old times, Beatrice looked at him with renewed interest. A local hero then? No, Jackson said firmly, tipping his hat. Just happened to be there. Good evening, Miss Morgan. He turned to leave, desperate to escape the curious eyes of the townsfolk and the even more unsettling effect of Beatrice Morgan's smile. Mr. Irwin, she called after him, I'm indebted to you. Perhaps I might buy you dinner tomorrow evening as a thank you. No need, he replied without turning back. Welcome to Redemption Creek. He mounted his horse and rode away, unaware that his evening encounter would be the first ripple in a tide about to change everything. The storm arrived with the dawn, blanketing Redemption Creek in heavy snow. Jackson woke to a world of white and the familiar ache in his chest grief, his constant companion. He went through the motions of his morning routine, feeding his few cattle in the barn, chopping wood, making coffee strong enough to cut through the lingering effects of last night's whiskey. His small cabin felt particularly empty that morning. He tried not to think of the woman from town, of that smile that had briefly warmed the frozen wasteland inside him. Such thoughts were dangerous. Hope was a luxury he'd surrendered long ago. A knock at his door surprised him mid-afternoon. Few people ventured out to his ranch, and none in weather like this. He opened it to find Sheriff Thomas Ellis, hat in hand, snow coating his shoulders. Jack, the sheriff nodded. Got trouble in town. That stagecoach can't move on in this weather, and we've got passengers needing places to stay. Hotels full with the mining company representatives. Jackson's jaw tightened. And this concerns me. How exactly? The schoolhouse is taking most, but there's a lady passenger. Well, she asked specifically if you might have room. Miss Morgan from yesterday. Said she'd pay fare for your trouble. No, Jackson said flatly. Jack, it's Christmas week. She's a proper lady traveling alone. The alternative is Ben's saloon backroom, and you know what kind of men pass through there. Jackson stared out at the falling snow, cursing silently. Fine. But just until the road's clear. An hour later, he was leading a second horse through the snow. Beatrice Morgan perched atop it with remarkable grace for someone clearly unaccustomed to frontier travel. She wore a heavy coat over her dress, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. I appreciate this more than I can say, Mr. Irwin, she said as they reached his property. I understand it's an imposition. It's nothing, he replied stiffly. Sheriff didn't give me much choice. If his rudeness offended her, she didn't show it. Well, then I'm doubly grateful to Sheriff Ellis for his persuasiveness. Jackson helped her down from the horse, trying to ignore the delicate scent of lavender that clung to her despite the journey. He led her inside, suddenly aware of the cabin's sparse furnishings and utilitarian nature. It's not much, he said, removing his hat. Bedroom's through there, you can take it, I'll sleep out here. Beatrice removed her gloves slowly. This is lovely. Did you build it yourself? Previous owner did. I just maintain it. She nodded, studying him with those clear blue eyes. And what brought you to Redemption Creek, Mr. Irwin? Business? Adventure? Nothing brought me here, he said, turning away to stoke the fire. Just running from ghosts. He felt her watching him but couldn't bear to meet her gaze. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air too thick with questions he'd spent 2 years avoiding. I'll make some coffee, he said, eager to occupy his hands. May I help? She asked. No need. Beatrice sighed softly. Mr. Irwin, we may be stuck together for several days. Perhaps we might try for civility at least. Jackson paused, a tin of coffee in his hand. She was right, and he knew it. His mother would have been ashamed of his hospitality. Jackson, he said finally, if we're to be housemates, you might as well use my name. Her smile returned, warming the room more effectively than the crackling fire. Jackson, she repeated, and I'm Beatrice, though most call me Bea. What brings you to Colorado, Beatrice? He asked, forcing himself to make conversation as he prepared the coffee. "A teaching position," she replied, removing her coat and hanging it near the fire. "In Silver Summit, about 30 miles west. The school board arranged my passage." Jackson nodded. Silver Summit was a newer settlement growing rapidly with the silver mines, long way from the south. "Virginia," she confirmed. "After the war, there wasn't much left for me there. My parents passed, our home was taken. Teaching seemed a respectable way for a woman alone to make her way." There was more to her story. He could hear it in the careful way she chose her words, but he didn't press. Everyone in the West carried secrets. It was an unspoken rule not to dig too deeply. They settled into an uneasy routine as the snow continued to fall. Jackson spent much of the day tending to the animals and ensuring they had enough firewood. Beatrice, to his surprise, proved herself useful rather than burdensome. She took over the cooking without being asked, turning his basic provisions into meals that reminded him of better days. On the third evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, the silence between them had evolved from hostile to companionable. Jackson found himself watching her as she mended a tear in her traveling cloak, her fingers nimble with the needle. "You've been alone a long time," she observed without looking up from her work. It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered anyway. "Yes, by choice." He stared into the fire. "Seemed easier that way." Beatrice set her mending aside. "When I lost my family, I thought the same. That loneliness was safer than risking more loss." Her voice was gentle, free of pity. "I was wrong. With all due respect, Miss Morgan, you don't know the first thing about my circumstances." "No," she agreed, "but I recognize the look of someone running from ghosts, as you put it. I carried that same look for years after Gettysburg." Jackson's eyes snapped to hers. "You were at Gettysburg." "My father was a doctor. I assisted him in the field hospital." Her expression grew distant. "So much blood. So many boys younger than me, crying for their mothers as they died." The admission hung between them, unexpected and raw. Jackson felt something shift in his perception of her, no longer just a refined Southern lady, but a survivor like him. "My wife and son died in a raid," he said suddenly, the words emerging without his permission. "Shoshone renegades, though I later learned they'd been provoked by white settlers. I was away, delivering cattle to Fort Laramie, by the time I returned." His voice faltered. Beatrice didn't reach for him or offer empty condolences. She simply nodded, acknowledging his pain with the respect of someone who understood. "Emma and James," he continued after a moment, their names rusty on his tongue. "She was 26. He had just turned 4. How long ago?" Beatrice asked softly. 2 years, 3 months, 14 days. The precision of his answer hung in the air between them. Jackson stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. "They say time heals. They're wrong." "No," Beatrice agreed. "Time doesn't heal. It just teaches us to carry the weight differently." Jackson turned to look at her, struck by the wisdom in her words and the absence of the platitudes he'd grown to despise. He realized with a start that this was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone in months. "How did you do it?" he asked. "Move forward." She considered the question carefully. "One day at a time, by finding purpose in helping others, by allowing myself to feel joy without guilt when it came." She met his gaze steadily. "And by realizing that honoring their memory means living fully, not just surviving." Her words found a home in the empty spaces of his heart, uncomfortable but resonant with truth. The storm lasted 5 days. 5 days of shared meals, careful conversations, and gradual thawing of Jackson's frozen defenses. He found himself watching for Beatrice's smile, that unexpected brightening of her features that seemed to chase shadows from the corners of his cabin. He caught himself wondering what made her laugh, what stories lay behind the occasional far-off look in her eyes. On the fifth morning, the sun broke through the clouds, glittering across the pristine white landscape. The temperature had risen, and the snow had begun to melt in patches. "Roads should be passable by tomorrow," Jackson said over breakfast, surprised by the reluctance he felt at the prospect of her leaving. "Yes," Beatrice agreed, her usual cheerfulness subdued. "I should be able to continue to Silver Summit." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Jackson cleared his throat. "I could ride with you if you'd like, ensure you arrive safely." Her eyes brightened. "I'd appreciate that, though I wouldn't want to impose further. It's no imposition." The words came easily, honestly. After breakfast, Jackson suggested they check on a newborn calf in the barn. Beatrice eagerly agreed, bundling herself against the cold. The fresh air was bracing after days confined indoors, and Jackson found himself pointing out features of his small ranch as they walked, stories and memories rising to the surface after years of suppression. In the barn, Beatrice cooed over the wobbly-legged calf, her face alive with delight. "He's beautiful," she said, gently stroking the animal's soft head. "What will you name him?" Jackson blinked. "Name him. They're cattle, not pets." "Everything deserves a name," she insisted. "How about Lazarus, since he was born during the storm and survived against the odds?" Despite himself, Jackson smiled. "Lazarus it is." As they exited the barn, Beatrice slipped on a patch of ice. Jackson caught her, his arms encircling her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, faces inches apart, breath mingling in the cold air. Jackson felt a surge of something long-dormant desire, yes, but more than that. Connection. Possibility. The moment broke when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Jackson stepped back, steadying Beatrice before turning toward the sound. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, heading toward the cabin. "Stay here," he instructed, moving protectively in front of her. His hand instinctively went to his hip, though he hadn't carried a gun in 2 years. As the riders drew closer, Jackson recognized the center figure as Sheriff Ellis. The men flanking him were strangers, one older with a distinguished bearing, the other younger with a serious expression. "Jack," the sheriff called as they approached. "Roads are clearing. Thought I'd check on you folks." He tipped his hat to Beatrice. "Miss Morgan, hope Jack's been a decent host." "More than decent, Sheriff," she replied warmly. "I'm in his debt." The older stranger dismounted, eyes fixed on Beatrice. "Miss Morgan." "Beatrice Morgan from Charlottesville." Beatrice tensed beside Jackson. "Yes, sir, and you are William Prescott, chairman of the Silver Summit School Board." "This is my son, Peter." He indicated the younger man. "We were concerned when you didn't arrive as scheduled, so we came to Redemption Creek to inquire. The sheriff mentioned you were waiting out the storm here." Peter Prescott dismounted, approaching with an outstretched hand and a warm smile directed at Beatrice. "We're relieved to find you well, Miss Morgan. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." Jackson noted the appreciative way the younger Prescott looked at Beatrice, and something possessive flared within him. He stepped forward, placing himself subtly between them. "Miss Morgan was just about to have lunch. Perhaps you gentlemen would like to join us." The invitation surprised everyone, including himself. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up, but he wisely said nothing. Inside the cabin, Jackson observed the interaction between Beatrice and the Prescotts with growing unease. William spoke at length about the school and the town's rapid development. Peter, meanwhile, directed his attention almost exclusively to Beatrice, his admiration obvious. "We have prepared the schoolmaster's house for you," Peter was saying. "It's modest but comfortable. My mother has arranged for some ladies of the town to help you settle in." "That's very kind," Beatrice replied. I'm eager to see the school and meet my students. Peter will be one of your school trustees, William explained. He's quite invested in education for our growing community. The younger Prescott smiled bashfully. I merely believe in the importance of learning, especially on the frontier. Jackson remained silent, acutely aware of the contrast between Peter Prescott, educated, cultured, clearly prosperous, and himself. The 5 days with Beatrice had awakened something in him he'd thought dead, but now reality intruded. What could he offer a woman like her? A run-down ranch, a life of hardship, and a heart still haunted by ghosts. After lunch, the visitors prepared to depart. "We can escort you to Silver Summit tomorrow, Miss Morgan," William offered. "The stage won't run for another few days, but we have a comfortable carriage." Before Beatrice could respond, Jackson spoke up. "I already offered to take her. Promised, in fact." 4 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise. Beatrice's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or hope. "That's really not necessary, Irwin," Peter said dismissively. "It's a long journey, and I gave my word," Jackson interrupted firmly. "Unless Miss Morgan prefers otherwise." Beatrice glanced between the men, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Mr. Irwin has been kind enough to offer, and I've accepted, but I thank you for your concern, gentlemen." After the visitors departed, an awkward silence descended. Jackson busied himself with chores, avoiding Beatrice's gaze and the conversation he knew they needed to have. That evening, as they sat before the fire for what would be their last night together, Beatrice finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to insist on taking me tomorrow." The Prescott seemed quite capable. "I said I would," he replied simply. "I keep my promises." She studied him for a long moment. "Is that the only reason?" Jackson stared into the flames, wrestling with emotions he'd kept buried for so long. "No," he admitted finally. "It's not." "Then why?" He looked at her then, taking in the gentle curve of her cheek, the questioning tilt of her head, the warmth in her eyes that had somehow penetrated the ice around his heart. "Because these 5 days have been the first time in 2 years I've felt anything but numb," he said honestly. "And I'm not ready for that to end." Beatrice moved to sit beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender scent of her hair. "Jackson," she said softly, "what exactly are you feeling?" "Afraid," he admitted. "Confused, alive." He paused, gathering courage. "When I see you smile, it's like seeing the sun after an endless winter. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve to feel this way again." "Why not?" she challenged gently. "I couldn't protect them," he said, pain lacing his words. "Emma, James, I wasn't there. I failed them." Beatrice placed her hand over his. "You didn't fail anyone. You survived a terrible tragedy. And surviving isn't a betrayal, it's the hardest thing in the world." Her touch anchored him, warm and real. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed. "How to care again, how to risk it." "Neither do I," she admitted with a small smile. "But perhaps we could learn together, slowly." Jackson looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "Tomorrow, after I take you to Silver Summit?" "Yes." "Would it be too forward to ask if I might call on you, properly?" Her smile, that same smile that had first cracked the ice around his heart, bloomed across her face. "I would like that very much." The journey to Silver Summit the next day took them through breathtaking mountain scenery, the freshly fallen snow glistening under a clear blue sky. They rode side by side, conversation flowing more easily now that certain truths had been acknowledged between them. Jackson found himself sharing stories of his life before the tragedy, his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west as a young man, the early years with Emma building their first ranch in Wyoming. Each memory, once too painful to revisit, now felt like a tribute rather than a betrayal. In turn, Beatrice told him of her life in Virginia, her education at a ladies' seminary, and her experiences during and after the war. She spoke of her decision to head west, seeking not just employment but purpose in a world that had changed irrevocably. "I never expected to find someone like you," she confessed as they stopped to rest the horses beside a frozen creek. "Especially not through a runaway horse and a snowstorm." "Life has strange ways of bringing people together," Jackson replied, surprising himself with the optimism in his voice. "Though I'm still not convinced I deserve a second chance." "Perhaps that's not for you to decide," Beatrice suggested, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps some things are meant to be, whether we feel worthy or not." As they approached Silver Summit in the late afternoon, Jackson felt a growing anxiety. The town was larger than Redemption Creek, more prosperous, with painted buildings and boardwalks lining the main street. It represented a world that seemed far removed from his solitary existence. At the schoolhouse, they were met by a small welcoming committee, including the Prescotts. Jackson observed the way the townspeople immediately took to Beatrice, drawn by her warmth and grace. Peter Prescott hovered attentively, clearly staking his claim. After helping Beatrice settle her belongings in the small but tidy teacher's house, Jackson found himself hesitating on her porch, hat in hands, suddenly uncertain. "Well," he said awkwardly, "you're safely delivered." Beatrice smiled up at him. "So I am. Thank you, Jackson, for everything." He nodded, painfully aware of curious eyes watching them from neighboring houses. "I should get back before dark." "When will I see you again?" she asked directly. The question gave him courage. "Sunday. I could come for church, then perhaps lunch. I'd like that." Impulsively, he reached for her hand, raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that surprised them both. "Until Sunday, then." He rode away feeling lighter than he had in years, her smile lingering in his mind like a promise. True to his word, Jackson returned that Sunday, and the next, and the one after that. Through the winter months, he made the journey to Silver Summit whenever weather permitted, sometimes staying overnight at the town's hotel. The townsfolk grew accustomed to seeing the once reclusive rancher in their midst, noted the changes in him: the straighter posture, the trimmed beard, the occasional smile. In Redemption Creek, the transformation was even more evident. Jackson began making repairs to his ranch that had long been neglected. He hired 2 hands to help expand his cattle operation. He reduced his visits to Murphy's saloon, and when he did go, he drank coffee more often than whiskey. "Never thought I'd see the day," Murphy remarked one evening in March. "Jack Irwin, whistling while he mends fences." Spring came to the mountains, bringing wildflowers and new possibilities. Jackson and Beatrice's courtship progressed with careful deliberation, each respecting the other's past losses while building something new together. They exchanged letters between visits, sharing thoughts too personal for public conversations. It was during an April picnic in a meadow near Silver Summit that Jackson finally found the courage to speak what had been growing in his heart. "They said I'd forgotten how to feel," he told her as they sat together beneath a blooming apple tree. "The people in town. They whispered about it, how I'd turned to stone after losing Emma and James." He took her hand, marveling at how natural it now felt. "They were right. I had forgotten. Or rather, I'd chosen not to remember because feeling hurt too much." Beatrice squeezed his hand encouragingly. "But that day in Redemption Creek, when you smiled at me after I'd pulled you from that horse's path, something cracked open inside me." He touched her cheek gently. "Your smile reminded me that my heart was still beating, still capable of more than just pain." "Jackson," she whispered, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Beatrice Morgan," he said simply. I didn't think I'd ever love again, but here I am, loving you with a heart I thought was buried alongside my family." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "And I love you, Jackson Irwin, with a heart that has known sorrow but chooses joy, chooses you." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he hadn't known he was searching for. They married in June 1878, in a ceremony that brought together the communities of both Redemption Creek and Silver Summit. Beatrice finished her teaching year before moving to Jackson's ranch, which by then hardly resembled the neglected property she'd first encountered during the snowstorm. Together, they built a new life. Jackson expanded his ranch, eventually becoming one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Beatrice opened a small school on their property for the children of nearby ranchers and their own ranch hands. They renovated the cabin, adding rooms and comforts that transformed it into a proper home. When their first child was born a year after their wedding, a daughter they named Hope, Jackson held the infant with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Are you all right?" Beatrice asked from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "I am now," he answered, bending to kiss her forehead. "Because of your smile." 5 years after that fateful winter storm, the Irwin Ranch hosted a Christmas gathering that filled their home with warmth and laughter. 3-year-old Samuel toddled after his sister Hope, both children the image of their parents. Friends from both towns mingled in the large main room while snow fell gently outside the windows. Sheriff Ellis, now sporting gray in his mustache, raised a glass in toast to Jackson and Beatrice, who reminded us all that second chances are possible, even in this harsh land. Later, as the guests departed and the children slept, Jackson and Beatrice stood on their porch, his arm wrapped securely around her waist as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here, that night you rescued me from the runaway horse?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. Jackson shook his head, smiling down at the woman who had brought him back to life. "I couldn't imagine anything beyond surviving each day. You taught me to live again." "We taught each other," she corrected gently. As they returned to the warmth of their home, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of grief to this abundance of joy. The pain of his past would always be with him, a shadow that occasionally darkened bright days. But Beatrice's smile, that first one that had pierced his armor, and everyone since continued to remind him that the heart's capacity for love was endless, even when it had been broken. They had both carried ghosts to Redemption Creek. Together, they had laid them to rest, not through forgetting, but by honoring their memory with lives fully lived and deeply loved.